Let's get PM2 installed on our machines and see how it can help us to manage a cluster of worker processes. By the way, PM2 stands for Process Manager 2. Why 2? What happened to Process Manager 1? That's a mystery shrouded in secrecy that we'll probably never find out. Alright, PM2 is on npm, so to install it, in our terminal, we can do npm install PM2. Now, I suggest you include PM2 in your dependencies by saving it to your package.json, just like we do with all of our other dependencies. So I'm going to install PM2 as a local package in our performance example folder. It's not a development dependency because we'll be running our node server with PM2 in production. However, for convenience, many people like to install PM2 as a global module, which you can do by using the -g flag when typing npm install PM2-G. I'll do that here as well to make it easier to demonstrate some of the features inside of our command line. PM2 is now installed as a global module, so I'll clear the terminal. We can now run PM2 directly and use it to manage our server process. We have the PM2 command. Let me make this a little bit smaller so you can see. And the PM2 tool takes in different commands, which we can use, for example, to start our server process. The most basic way of using PM2 is by passing in the start command, followed by the JavaScript file we want to run. In our case, server.js. PM2 has now started our server, and again, let me make this a little bit bigger. We can see that we have one instance of our server, and it's currently online using 0% of our CPU and about 8 megabytes of memory. Just like before, we can make requests in our browser to our server at port 3000 and, for example, hit our timer endpoint and the root in a second tab. This part hasn't changed. Back in our terminal, notice that PM2 is running in the background. I can type other commands into the terminal, and the server is still running. We can list the processes that are being managed by PM2 with the PM2 list command. You can also use PM2 ls or PM2 status. If we type one of these commands, we get the current status of our server. We have one process. This is our master process that's being managed by PM2. We'll see how to manage the worker processes in just a second. But we can stop our server by typing PM2 stop and typing in the ID of the process or the name, so server. We can start it back up again with PM2 start server, this time calling it by name. And if we wanted to terminate it and remove it from the list of processes managed by PM2, we would type PM2 delete server. Alright, this is all fine and all, but why do we really want to use PM2? Well, PM2 comes with clustering built in, which means that we can simplify our code to remove any usage of the cluster module. We don't need to fork inside of JavaScript because instead, PM2 will fork our process. our code in server.js here will be run as the worker process, so we don't need to check the isMaster flag, for example. We can get rid of our entire master block here and leave just the worker process aspect, where we listen on port 3000. Let's remove our comments here as well, and we can get rid of our cluster module from the imports, as well as the OS module. Much simpler, right? To start a cluster in PM2, what we'll do is run our PM2 start command for server.js, this time passing in the -i flag. I for instance. It measures the amount of worker processes that will be created in our cluster. We can type a number like 2 to start 2 workers, or max if we want to start the maximum amount of workers to take full advantage of the amount of CPUs in our machine. You can see that on my machine, 8 processes have been started and are being managed in our PM2 cluster. Just like when we were using our cluster module, we can make 2 requests side by side, say to the timer endpoint, and they're executed in different processes. One request doesn't block the other. In fact, remember, the PM2 tool takes advantage of our cluster module under the hood. We can always write PM2 list to show the current status of our server. And you might be asking, if PM2 is managing all of these processes, where do my logs go? Why am I not seeing any logs in the terminal? We can always type PM2 logs, and we get a real-time view of what's being logged in our server right now. In fact, as you can see, the output is saved even when we stop our server. So I can Control-C out of this and restart our cluster by writing PM2 restart server. Our list now shows that each server has been restarted once. Each process is using a little bit of our CPU because it's just starting up. And in our logs, if I type PM2 logs again, this time I'll exit out of this and type PM2 logs -- lines 200 for the last 200 saved lines of logs. And we can now see that our historical logs are preserved. For example, we see that we restarted the master here at some point, even though our current code doesn't include any logs for the master. This log is from when we ran PM2 start while still using the cluster module in our server.js. PM2 includes a lot of advanced logging functionality, including sending logs to a file, and even doing log rotation, so that the server doesn't get overwhelmed by one giant log file like we discussed earlier in the course. We'll demonstrate more features later. For now, let me clear the console, make sure you have PM2 installed, stretch, take a moment's rest, and in the next video, we'll step beyond the basic functionality. We'll take a look at some of the really useful things that PM2 allows us to do when managing live clusters of node processes. I'll see you soon.